The world knew him as the man who stared down criminals with a .44 Magnum. But in 1951, Clint Eastwood was just another faceless laborer in the Oregon wilderness, swinging an axe for $1.50 an hour. His hands weren't made for quick draws yet. They were blistered, bleeding, covered in tree sap and sawdust. No cameras, no directors, no fame. Just a 21-year-old kid who dropped out of college, running from a future that terrified him more than any movie villain ever could. And somewhere between those towering Douglas firs and the smoke of forest fires, something happened that the Hollywood machine would spend decades trying to bury. A secret so dangerous that when it finally surfaced in a 1989 courtroom, it nearly destroyed the legend of the man with no name before the world even knew his real story. If this story intrigues you, subscribe to our channel. We bring you the untold stories behind Hollywood's greatest legends, the ones they never wanted you to know. May 1951. Clint Eastwood Jr. sat behind the wheel of a rusted Ford pickup, watching the California coastline disappear in his rearview mirror. He was 20 years old, broke, and running. Los Angeles City College had kicked him out after 2 semesters of failed classes and bar fights. His parents had made it clear, no more handouts, no more second chances. The steel mill job his father offered in Oakland felt like a noose tightening around his neck. So Clint did what desperate young men have always done when the walls close in. He ran north, chasing rumors of logging work in Oregon where a strong back could still mean something, where nobody asked questions about your past. The drive took 3 days. $43. That was all that separated him from complete destitution. When he finally crossed into Oregon, the landscape changed in ways that unsettled him. The trees grew taller, darker, more ancient. The mountains rose like walls, cutting off escape routes, and the logging camps, when he finally found them scattered through the Cascade Range, looked less like places of employment and more like prisons built from raw timber and desperation. Cascade Lumber Company operated 17 camps across southern Oregon in 1951, and their reputation preceded them. High turnover, dangerous conditions, accidents that company lawyers somehow always managed to classify as worker negligence. But they paid in cash, asked no questions, and promised steady work to anyone willing to sign the waiver. The waiver absolved Cascade Lumber of responsibility for injury, death, or disappearance. That last word stuck with him, disappearance. As if men didn't just die in these woods, they vanished entirely, swallowed by the forest and forgotten. But $43 doesn't leave room for moral contemplation. Clint signed his name, accepted the battered hard hat and dull axe they handed him, and walked into the Oregon wilderness, as anonymous as he'd ever been in his life. Camp 17, 37 men living in communal bunkhouses, working 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. The work was medieval in its brutality. No chainsaws yet, not for the new guys, just axes, cross-cut saws, and raw muscle. It happened twice in Clint's first month. 2 men pulverized under thousands of pounds of timber, their screams cut short so quickly that the forest seemed to swallow the sound before it could fully form. The other men in Camp 17 were ghosts long before they died. Veterans from World War II who couldn't adjust to civilian life, drifters running from the law or failed marriages, alcoholics who'd burned every bridge and found themselves in the only place that would still take them. Clint kept to himself, wrote letters home that he never mailed, and tried not to think about the fact that he'd traded one form of imprisonment for another. But there was one man who stood out, Raymond Hollis, 42 years old, built like a bear, with hands so calloused they looked like leather gloves. Ray had been working Cascade camps for 11 years, longer than anyone else, and for reasons Clint never fully understood, Ray took an interest in him. It started with small corrections, the angle of Clint's axe swing, the placement of his feet during a cut. Within 6 weeks, Clint's productivity doubled. Within 3 months, he was one of the top cutters in Camp 17, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, Ray began to talk. He told Clint about the system, how Cascade Lumber kept men trapped in debt through the company store, selling supplies at inflated prices, creating a cycle where workers could never quite earn enough to leave. He explained the quotas, the unspoken rule that if you didn't meet your daily cut target, your bunk would be empty by morning and nobody would ask where you went. And he warned Clint about the accidents that weren't really accidents, the way certain men who caused trouble ended up under falling trees with suspicious regularity. But Ray also told him something else, something that would haunt Clint for the next 70 years. There was a woman. Her name was Brolin, and she worked as a camp cook in the administrative compound 3 miles from Camp 17. Company policy strictly prohibited fraternization between loggers and staff. The penalty was immediate termination without pay, and in some cases physical removal from the camp by company enforcers. But Ray had met her anyway, had fallen in love with her, and was planning to run away with her at the end of the season. August 1952. The temperature climbed into the 90s, a rare heat wave that turned the Oregon forests into a tinderbox. And the company, desperate to meet their annual quotas before the inevitable wildfires shut down operations, pushed the crews harder than ever. 16-hour shifts became standard. Safety protocols, already minimal, were ignored entirely. Men worked through exhaustion, through injuries, through the kind of bone-deep fatigue that makes fatal mistakes inevitable. Clint had been in the camps for 15 months by then. He'd saved nearly $400 hidden in a tobacco tin buried under his bunk. Enough to get back to California, rent a room, maybe try his luck in Los Angeles again. He'd been making plans, counting days, imagining the moment he could walk away from Cascade Lumber and never look back. But then Ray disappeared. It happened on a Tuesday morning. Ray's bunk was empty at wake-up call. The foreman marked him absent without leave. Nobody asked questions. But Clint knew. Ray had made his move. He'd gone to get Catherine, and they were running. Except Ray came back 3 days later. Alone. His face was a mask of barely controlled rage, his knuckles split and bleeding. He wouldn't speak to anyone, just grabbed his axe and walked into the cutting zone like a man trying to work himself to death. When Clint finally cornered him among the trees, Ray told him everything. Catherine was gone. The company had found out about their relationship, and she'd been fired and removed from the camp. But that wasn't the worst part. Ray had gone to the administrative compound to find her, and what he discovered there changed everything. The company kept detailed records of every worker, every incident, every violation. And in those records, Ray had seen something that made him realize the entire operation was criminal. The accidents weren't accidents. Cascade Lumber was deliberately creating hazardous conditions, letting men die, and using their life insurance policies to fund operations. The company had taken out policies on every worker, named themselves as beneficiaries, and was literally profiting from mortality. Catherine had discovered this, had planned to go to the authorities, which is why they'd removed her so quickly. Ray told Clint all of this in a whisper, surrounded by ancient trees, and then Ray told him the plan. They were going to burn it down, the administrative compound, the records building, all of it. Clint should have said no, should have walked away, should have grabbed his tobacco tin of savings and disappeared. But he didn't, because somewhere in those 15 months of brutality, something had calcified inside him, a rage at systems that crushed men for profit, a hatred of authorities who looked the other way as long as the timber kept flowing. They chose August 19th, 1952. A moonless night, temperature still in the 80s, wind blowing east toward the administrative compound. Ray had been stockpiling materials for weeks, kerosene from the generator shed, rags soaked in pine resin. The plan was simple. Wait until 2 in the morning, when the night watchman made his rounds. Break into the records building, douse everything in kerosene, light it, run. At 1:30, Ray touched his shoulder. No words, just a nod. They slipped out of the bunkhouse and made their way down the 3-mile trail to the administrative compound. The forest was absolutely silent. When they reached the compound perimeter, Ray held up a hand. The night watchman was 60 years old, overweight, and bored. 12 minutes per circuit. They'd have a 6-minute window to get inside, start the fire and escape. Except everything went wrong immediately. The records building wasn't locked. The door stood open, light spilling from inside, and voices. 2 men, maybe 3, working late. Company accountants probably. Ray froze. Clint froze. The plan was dead. They should have retreated right then, but Ray didn't retreat. He'd come too far, sacrificed too much, and the rage that had been building inside him for 11 years finally broke through. He walked straight toward that open door, kerosene can in hand, and Clint, operating on instinct rather than thought, followed him. What happened next would be contested in legal documents for decades. The official Cascade Lumber Company report stated that a fire of unknown origin destroyed the administrative records building, resulting in significant property damage but no loss of life. 3 accountants were treated for smoke inhalation. The fire was attributed to faulty electrical wiring. Investigation closed, but the unofficial version told a different story. Ray confronted the accountants, demanded to know where Catherine had been taken. The accountants claimed they didn't know. Ray didn't believe them, started pouring kerosene anyway, threatening to burn them along with the records unless they told him the truth. And that's when Clint intervened, not to stop Ray, to contain him, because the accountants were already panicking, already reaching for the phone under the desk. If Ray poured that kerosene, If he lit the match, they'd all be identified and arrested within hours. So Clint did the only thing he could think of. He grabbed the kerosene can, told the accountants to run, and when they were clear of the building, he poured accelerant himself and threw the match. The records building burned to ash in 47 minutes. The heat was so intense that it ignited 2 adjacent structures. By dawn, the entire administrative compound was a smoking ruin, and Cascade Lumber Company had lost 15 years of documentation, worker contracts, insurance policies, safety violation records, all of it gone. Clint and Ray made it back to Camp 17 before sunrise. They stripped off their smoky clothes, buried them in the forest, scrubbed themselves raw in the cold creek water, and climbed into their bunks just as the wake-up bell rang. When the foreman announced the fire at breakfast, both men showed appropriate shock and concern. And when company investigators arrived 3 days later, both men swore they'd been asleep all night and knew nothing. The investigation lasted 2 weeks. The official conclusion was accidental fire caused by faulty wiring. No arson, no criminal charges. Cascade Lumber Company collected insurance and began rebuilding. And Clint started planning his exit. He waited until October when the fall rains returned. He gave his 2 weeks' notice, citing family obligations. On October 23, 1952, Clint collected his final paycheck, retrieved his tobacco tin, and drove away from Camp 17 forever. He never looked back, never contacted Ray again, never spoke about the Oregon years to anyone. But Raymond Hollis wasn't as lucky. Company investigators might have closed the official case, but privately, Cascade Lumber knew what had happened. They had their suspicions, and Ray, with his known relationship with Catherine Brolin, was at the top of the list. They couldn't prove it, couldn't prosecute, but they could make his life hell. Ray's work assignments became increasingly dangerous, and on November 14, 1952, exactly 3 weeks after Clint left, Raymond Hollis died in a logging accident. A tree fell wrong, they said, crushed him instantly. Nobody's fault, just bad luck. Clint found out 3 months later when a letter arrived at his parents' Oakland address. It was from Catherine Brolin. She'd tracked him down somehow, wanted him to know what had really happened. The letter explained that Ray's death wasn't an accident, that the company had deliberately arranged it as punishment for the fire, that she had evidence, documentation she'd managed to smuggle out, and she was going to the newspapers, to the authorities. The letter concluded with a warning. If anyone from Cascade Lumber contacted Clint, if anyone started asking questions about August 1952, he should deny everything. She signed it simply, Catherine. No return address. Clint burned the letter immediately and tried to forget that Oregon had ever happened. Working construction to pay rent. He was 24, lean and hard from physical labor, with a face that cameras loved even if casting directors couldn't quite figure out what to do with him. Then he landed a contract with Universal Studios. Small roles, uncredited mostly. Background work in westerns where his comfort with physical labor made him believable, and slowly, methodically, Clint began building the persona that would eventually make him famous. The squint, the minimalist dialogue, the sense of controlled violence always simmering beneath the surface. Critics would later attribute these qualities to natural charisma or studied technique. But people who'd known him before recognized something else. This wasn't acting, this was protection, a mask he'd learned to wear so nobody would look too close and see what lay underneath. The Oregon years stayed buried for decades, through Rawhide, through the Sergio Leone films that made him an international star, through Dirty Harry and Unforgiven. Nobody asked where that particular edge came from, that quality of a man who'd seen darkness and survived it. They just assumed it was talent. But in 1989, during Clint's messy divorce from Maggie Johnson, everything nearly unraveled. The legal discovery process was brutal. Lawyers digging through financial records, employment history, personal correspondence, and somewhere in that excavation they found references to his time in Oregon. Nothing specific, just employment records from Cascade Lumber Company, pay stubs from 1951 and 1952, a gap in his work history that needed explaining. The lawyers started asking questions. What exactly had he done in Oregon? Why had he left so abruptly? Were there any incidents that might be relevant? And that's when court documents show Clint's attorneys fighting desperately to shut down that line of inquiry. They succeeded. The judge ruled that Clint's employment history from the 1950s had no bearing on the divorce case and ordered all related documents sealed. The questions stopped. And once again the Oregon years disappeared into legal limbo, protected by confidentiality orders and the basic fact that after nearly 40 years, most witnesses were dead and most records had burned. The Oregon story might have stayed buried forever if not for a bureaucratic accident. In 2023, the state of Oregon began digitizing historical records. Workers scanning old documents stumbled across boxes of Cascade Lumber Company materials that had somehow survived. These documents had been seized during a federal investigation in 1957 that examined labor practices across the Pacific Northwest timber industry. They'd been stored in a federal facility for decades, forgotten, and eventually transferred back to state archives. The digitization team uploaded everything to a public database without reviewing the contents first. And suddenly, 70 years after the fact, detailed records of Cascade Lumber's operations became freely accessible online, including employment records, including insurance policies, including internal memos discussing workplace safety and acceptable mortality rates. Researchers descended on the database within weeks. The story they uncovered was explosive. Cascade Lumber had indeed been operating an insurance fraud scheme, exactly as Catherine Brolin had alleged. They'd taken out life insurance policies on 847 workers over a 9-year period. They'd collected death benefits on 61 of those workers, and internal memos showed executives explicitly discussing the financial benefits of maintaining dangerous working conditions rather than implementing expensive safety measures. But what caught the attention of entertainment journalists was a different detail. In the employment records from 1951 to 1952, there was a listing for Clint Eastwood Jr., Camp 17, logger, hired May 1951, terminated October 1952, and in the margins of his employment file, someone had handwritten a note. Possible involvement in 1952 incident. Insufficient evidence. Recommend no action. The story hit entertainment news outlets in March 2023. Clint Eastwood suspected of arson in 1952, read the headlines. Clint's representatives issued a brief statement. Mr. Eastwood worked as a laborer in Oregon during 1951 to 1952 as part of the normal experiences of young men in that era. He was never charged with any crime, and any insinuations based on decades-old speculation are irresponsible. But for people who'd followed Clint's career closely, the revelation added context to questions they'd always had. Where did that edge come from? That quality of controlled danger that made his performances so compelling? The answer might have been there all along, buried in Oregon, in the story of a desperate young man who'd made choices that haunted him for the rest of his life. Camp 17 doesn't exist anymore. The site was abandoned in 1964 when Cascade Lumber Company went bankrupt following lawsuits related to workplace safety violations. Nature reclaimed what industry had briefly occupied, but the legacy persists. In 2019, a documentary filmmaker named Marcus Chen tracked down the location using historical records. He hiked in with a camera crew and was shocked to discover remnants still visible and carved into the trunk of a massive Douglas fir. Names, dozens of names. Men who'd worked Camp 17 had left their mark, scratching initials into the bark. Among those names, barely visible after 60 years of tree growth, were 2 sets of initials. RH 1951, and below it, CE 1952. Raymond Hollis and Clint Eastwood, memorialized in tree bark, silent witnesses to a period of American history that nobody talks about anymore. Chen's documentary, The Loggers: Oregon's Hidden History, premiered at Sundance in 2020. It focused on the timber industry's labor practices in the post-war era, using Cascade Lumber as a case study. The film mentioned Clint Eastwood's employment there, though Chen was scrupulous about not making accusations he couldn't prove. The documentary received critical acclaim, but limited distribution, too niche for mainstream audiences. But it serves as an important record of a time and place that shaped more than just one future movie star. There's a particular American archetype that Clint Eastwood embodied better than perhaps anyone else in cinema history. The strong, silent man. The loner who solves problems through controlled violence. The figure who operates outside societal structures because those structures have failed. We celebrate this archetype in westerns and action films without asking where it comes from or what it costs the men who live it. But the Oregon years offer an answer. That archetype isn't born from strength. It's born from trauma. From experiences where a young man learns that the world is fundamentally dangerous, that authority figures can't be trusted, that survival sometimes requires doing things you'll regret. The strong, silent man isn't heroic. He's a survivor processing trauma the only way he knows how, by shutting down emotionally and presenting an impenetrable exterior to a world that's already hurt him. Clint never talked about this publicly, but it's visible in his work if you know what to look for. The characters in Unforgiven aren't glamorous gunfighters. They're damaged men carrying psychological wounds that never quite heal. The protagonist of Gran Torino isn't a hero. He's a traumatized veteran trying to find redemption before he dies. Even Dirty Harry is fundamentally about a man so alienated from the systems he serves that he operates in constant, barely controlled rage. These aren't fantasies, they're case studies. So what's the truth? Did Clint Eastwood burn down the Cascade Lumber Company records building in August 1952? The evidence is circumstantial. The notation in his employment file, the timing of his departure, the fact that he never in 70 years of public life spoke about his Oregon experience except in the vaguest terms. None of it proves anything. All of it suggests questions that will probably never be definitively answered. What we know for certain is this. Clint Eastwood Jr. worked as a logger in southern Oregon from May 1951 to October 1952. During that time, he witnessed brutal working conditions, befriended a man named Raymond Hollis who died under suspicious circumstances. A fire destroyed company records that would have documented insurance fraud. And a woman named Brolin tried to expose that fraud and disappeared from the historical record shortly thereafter. We also know that Clint emerged from that experience, changed in fundamental ways. He developed a persona of controlled silence that became his trademark. He became obsessive about workplace safety in his own productions. He gravitated toward roles exploring themes of guilt, redemption, and the cost of violence. And he spent 70 years refusing to discuss a 15-month period of his youth that should have been relatively unremarkable. In 2025, Clint Eastwood is 94 years old. He's directed and starred in some of cinema's most important films. He's won Academy Awards, influenced generations of filmmakers, and created a body of work that will be studied for centuries. The kid who swung an axe in Oregon forests has become a legend, an icon, a symbol of American masculinity. But legends are constructed things. They require careful editing, strategic omissions, and cooperation in maintaining the narrative. The Clint Eastwood that the world knows is a carefully curated version of a much more complicated reality. Yet that complicated version is more interesting, more human, more relevant to the millions of working-class people who've faced similar moral dilemmas. Do you speak up when you see injustice, knowing it might cost you everything? Do you help a friend even when it puts you at risk? Do you compromise your values to survive, and if so, how do you live with that compromise afterward? These are the questions Clint's Oregon years pose, even if he's never answered them directly. Maybe the silence itself is the answer. The acknowledgement that some parts of our past can't be explained or justified, only carried forward as weight that shapes everything that comes after. The Douglas fir with the carved initials is still there, in what used to be Camp 17. It's over 300 years old now. Was already 250 when Clint Eastwood scratched his initials into the bark. The tree will likely stand for another 200 years, long after everyone who remembers the camps is dead, long after the films have degraded and the history has been forgotten. Trees don't care about human drama. They grow regardless, and in some poetic sense, that tree is the most honest witness to what happened in Oregon between 1951 and 1952. It was there. It saw. And it's not telling. Maybe that's the real lesson of Clint Eastwood's Oregon years. Some stories don't have neat conclusions. Some questions don't have satisfying answers. Some parts of our past remain ambiguous no matter how much we investigate. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the mystery is more valuable than the truth would be. Clint Eastwood became one of cinema's greatest storytellers, but the story he never told, the one about Oregon and logging camps and choices made in desperation, might be his most compelling narrative, not because of what it reveals, but because of what it conceals. The legend of the man with no name started long before Sergio Leone's cameras rolled. It started in a wilderness where a young man learned that sometimes the only way forward is silence, and that the price of survival might be a secret you carry to your grave. The tree stands, the initials remain, and somewhere in the space between documented fact and whispered rumor, the truth waits.